Does God exist? Perhaps no other question has sparked so much debate, inspired such monumental achievements, or led to such devastating tragedies. It is humanity's central intellectual showdown, a contest that has raged for millennia. In one corner, we have the greatest theologians and philosophers, armed with faith and logic. In the other, skeptics and scientists, relying on reason and empirical data. Today, we journey to the very heart of this battle. We will trace the path of these arguments from medieval monasteries to modern laboratories, from Thomas Aquinas' seemingly irrefutable 5 proofs to the blistering critique of new atheist Richard Dawkins. Prepare yourselves. We are going to dissect every single angle. You will learn why an argument that seemed rock solid 1,000 years ago might today be considered completely worthless, and conversely, how modern science has unexpectedly provided believers with new ammunition. This will not be a sermon or an anti-religious tract. This will be an honest deep dive into the greatest debate in history, and I promise you, by the end of this video, your perspective on this eternal question will never be the same. To truly grasp the scale of this battle, we need to go back in time. For most of human history, the question of God's existence simply wasn't a question. It was an axiom, the foundation of the cosmos, as certain as the sun rising in the east. All culture, morality, science and politics were built upon this bedrock. Attempts to prove God's existence were not so much about convincing non-believers, but rather intellectual exercises, a way to understand the nature of the Creator through the very reason he had bestowed upon humanity. Philosophers like Anselm of Canterbury or Thomas Aquinas operated in a world where doubt was considered heresy. Their goal was not to win over an atheist they likely never encountered, but to reinforce faith through logic, demonstrating that belief and reason did not conflict, but complemented each other. But then came the age of enlightenment. The pendulum swung dramatically. Thinkers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant subjected these classic proofs to a ruthless analysis and exposed critical flaws. The scientific revolution offered alternative explanations for the world, ones that didn't require the intervention of supernatural forces. And here we are in the 21st century, living in a fractured world. On one side are billions of believers. On the other, millions who view God as an illusion. The debate is now fiercer than ever before. This is our starting point as we begin our journey through the greatest arguments both for and against. Let's begin with one of history's most elegant and perhaps most contentious ideas, the ontological argument. Its author was Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury, who lived in the 11th century. Anselm's idea is striking in its simplicity and audacity. He proposed proving God's existence merely by starting from God's definition itself. Sounds like a magic trick, doesn't it? Let's take a closer look. Anselm begins by defining God. He says God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Try to truly grasp that phrase. This isn't just the greatest thing. It's something that surpasses any possible thought of greatness. It is the absolute limit of perfection our minds can possibly imagine. Now Anselm takes the next step. He argues that even the fool who denies God understands this definition, meaning the idea of that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the fool's mind. And now for the culmination. Anselm asks, what is more perfect, something that exists only in the mind, or something that exists both in the mind and in reality? The answer is obvious. Existence in reality is an added perfection. If that than which nothing greater can be conceived existed only in the mind, we could then conceive of something even greater, namely that very same being, but existing in reality as well. But this contradicts our original definition. We defined God as that which cannot be surpassed in thought. Therefore, to avoid this logical contradiction, we must concede that God exists not only in our minds, but in reality as well. Essentially, Anselm claims that existence is an inherent property of God, just like having 3 sides is an inherent property of a triangle. You cannot conceive of a triangle without 3 sides, and similarly, according to Anselm, you cannot conceive of God as non-existent. This is pure, distilled logic, attempting to extract reality from concept. Imagine the blueprint for a perfect house. Anselm is essentially arguing, if that house is truly perfect, it cannot remain just a blueprint. Its very perfection demands that it be constructed in reality. Naturally, such an ingenious argument couldn't escape criticism. The first major challenge came from Anselm's own contemporary, a monk named Gaunilo. Gaunilo responded with his famous thought experiment, known as the Lost Island. He challenged Anselm, essentially saying, "All right, let's use your method to prove the existence of something else." Gaunilo proposed this. Imagine the most perfect island conceivable. It has the perfect climate, the most delicious fruits, crystal clear water, and it is bursting with treasure and everything your heart desires. This island is that island than which none greater can be conceived. Following Anselm's exact logic, this island must exist in reality. If it only existed in our imagination, it wouldn't be the most perfect, because a real island is always more perfect than an imaginary one. But this is absurd. We cannot simply invent something, attribute the property of perfection to it, and instantly assert its existence. Gaunilo effectively demonstrated that the ontological argument was a clever logical trick, applicable to proving the existence of anything, from a perfect island to a perfect sandwich. Anselm, incidentally, did reply to Gaunilo. He argued that his proof applies only to God, because only God possesses necessary existence, whereas the existence of islands or sandwiches is always contingent. Nevertheless, the seed of doubt had been planted. 700 years later, the argument was taken up by one of the giants of philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Kant delivered what is perhaps the most devastating blow to the ontological proof. He argued that Anselm and his followers committed a fundamental error. They treated existence as a property, or, as philosophers say, a predicate. That is, they treated it as a characteristic, like being omnipotent or being perfectly good, that you can add to an object to make it superior. Kant asserted that existence is not a property at all. Existence is the condition under which an object can possess any properties whatsoever. Imagine describing 100 thalers, the historical currency Kant used. You can say they are round, silver and shiny. Now add the descriptor that they are existing. Does that suddenly put more thalers in your pocket? No. The description of 100 real thalers and 100 imaginary thalers is exactly the same. The difference is not in the properties themselves, but whether those properties refer to something in the actual world. Thus, Kant concluded that we cannot simply tack existence onto the definition of God and consider the matter proven. We must first establish that something corresponding to that definition actually exists in reality. If the ontological argument tries to deduce God purely from the philosopher's armchair, the next set of proofs completely shifts gears, appealing instead to the world all around us. We travel back to the 13th century, to the era of the great thinker Thomas Aquinas. His magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae, contains the famous 5 ways to prove the existence of God. These aren't 5 different gods. They are 5 distinct logical paths that, according to Aquinas, inevitably lead to the exact same conclusion. Let's walk through the first way, which is known as the argument from motion, or the unmoved mover. Aquinas begins with a simple and self-evident observation. Everything in the world is in motion, but he defines motion in a broader sense than just moving through space. For him, motion is any transition from a potential state to an actual state. For instance, cold water is potentially hot, and the heating process is motion. A tree is potentially a table, and the work of the carpenter is also motion. Aquinas then reasons this way. Nothing can initiate its own movement. To make cold water hot, you need fire. To turn a tree into a table, you need a carpenter. In other words, everything that is moving must be moved by something else. But this chain cannot extend infinitely. Imagine a train. The last car moves because the second to last car pulls it. That one, in turn, moves because of the one before it, and so on. However, if this chain of cars were infinite, the train would never stop moving in the first place. There must be a first element, an initiating element, that starts the motion without being moved by anything prior to itself. This very first element, this locomotive of the universe, that is what we call God. Aquinas argues that if we do not acknowledge the existence of an unmoved mover, the entire concept of motion and change in the world becomes meaningless. The universe turns into an absurd, infinite train, somehow managing to run without a locomotive. This argument holds enormous intuitive power. We constantly see cause and effect around us. The idea that this gigantic chain of causes and effects must have a first link seems extremely logical. It's an attempt to find the fundamental ground for all the dynamics in our world. If everything changes, there must be something unchanging that initiates all that change. Aquinas suggests we look at any moving object and mentally rewind the chain of causes until we hit a dead end, a point beyond which there is nothing else. And that point, he argues, is God. Aquinas' second way is quite similar to the first, but with one critical difference. It is often referred to as the argument from efficient cause, or the first cause argument. While the first way focused on motion, the second focuses on existence itself. Aquinas again starts with a simple observation. We see an orderly sequence of efficient causality in the world. What does that mean? Simply put, nothing brings itself into existence. A child is born of parents. A house is built by builders. A book is written by an author. Every object or event has a cause. You exist because of your parents, who exist because of theirs, and so on. We again see a chain. But this time, it's a chain of existential causes. And once more, Aquinas asks the critical question, can this chain go back infinitely? His answer is an emphatic no. Here is why. In a chain of efficient causes, every subsequent link is entirely dependent on the one that precedes it. If you remove the first cause, the second and third disappear, and nothing at all remains. Let's use an analogy. Imagine a stone suspended in the air. You ask, why is it hanging there? You're told, a hand is holding it. You ask, and what is supporting the hand? They reply, another hand. And this continues infinitely. Is that a satisfactory answer? Absolutely not. Unless there is something primary that provides support, say the ground, the entire structure of hands and stones could not exist. It would collapse instantly. The universe operates under the same principle. If the chain of existence lacks a very first link, one that exists in itself, not created by anything else, then the entire universe could not have originated. There must be an uncaused first cause. And this self-sufficient primal cause, the source of all being, is what Aquinas names God. This argument attempts to answer one of philosophy's most fundamental questions. Why does anything exist at all rather than absolute nothingness? Aquinas asserts the answer lies in something whose very nature is simply to be. This being did not receive its existence from another. It is existence itself. Everything else exists only because it participates in, or derives from, this first cause. It is a powerful idea that forces us to reconsider the very foundations of reality. Aquinas' third way is perhaps the most challenging to grasp, but it is also one of the deepest philosophical arguments. It's called the argument from necessity and contingency. Let's try to unpack it. Aquinas looks at the world again and observes that everything within it is contingent or possible. What does that actually mean? It means these things have the capacity to either exist or not exist. For instance, you exist now, but there was a time when you didn't, and there will be a time when you won't again. The same applies to every tree, every planet, every star. Everything in our universe comes into being and eventually passes away. This implies that for every contingent thing, there is a point in time when it does not exist. Now, Aquinas makes a rather bold logical leap. He posits, if everything in the universe were contingent, then theoretically, a moment must have occurred when absolutely nothing existed. If every single thing has the potential not to exist, then it follows that, collectively, all things could fail to exist simultaneously. If such a moment of total non-being had ever occurred, nothing new could ever have come into existence. After all, out of nothing, nothing comes. But here's the crucial point. We exist. The world around us is real. This means that a moment of absolute total non-existence never actually transpired, and if that moment never happened, it logically follows that the universe must contain at least one thing that exists, not contingently, but necessarily. That is, something that absolutely cannot not exist. Its existence is self-sufficient, it is eternal and indestructible. However, Aquinas doesn't stop there. He acknowledges there might be several necessarily existing things, but their necessity might still be derived or caused by something else. We end up with a causal chain, just like in his previous arguments. And as we know, Aquinas finds infinite chains unacceptable. Therefore, he concludes, there must be a singular entity whose necessity is intrinsic, a being whose existence is uncaused and self-sufficient. This is absolute, unconditional necessity, and this entity is God. Essentially, this argument states that the mere existence of our transient, perishable world proves that something eternal and immutable must stand behind it. If everything were temporary, everything would have long ago vanished into oblivion. For the contingent to exist, it must be supported by something necessary. It is like a shaky bridge made of contingent planks suspended over the abyss of non-existence, held up only because its ends are anchored firmly to the bedrock of eternal necessity. Thomas Aquinas' fourth way, often called the argument from gradation or degrees of perfection, shifts our focus from the physical and metaphysical realms straight into the world of values. While this argument might seem a bit odd to the modern mind, it was profoundly compelling to the medieval consciousness. Aquinas starts with a simple observation. We constantly compare things in the world based on their relative perfection. We say, this person is kinder than that one. This painting is more beautiful than the other. This action is more noble. We rely heavily on comparative terms, more and less. For instance, we might say the sun is hotter than a campfire. But Aquinas reasons that the very possibility of such a comparison requires the existence of an absolute standard, a maximal degree of that quality. We can only speak of more hot and less hot because the concept of absolute heat exists. Similarly, we can only judge good and evil because we possess an understanding of absolute goodness. We evaluate beauty only because we have an ideal of absolute beauty. Therefore, all these relative degrees of perfection we observe in the world, kindness, truth, nobility, beauty, point toward the existence of something that possesses these qualities in their absolute maximal form. This something must be the ultimate source and measure of all perfection in the universe. It is itself absolute goodness, absolute truth, and absolute beauty. And this, of course, is God. Aquinas is heavily influenced here by Plato's philosophy, specifically his world of forms, or eidos. For Aquinas, everything good in our world is good, only insofar as it participates to some degree in this absolute source of goodness. They are essentially reflecting its light. The more perfect a thing is, the better it reflects this divine light. We can compare this line of reasoning to trying to define a straight line. We can draw many lines and claim that one is straighter than another, but that comparison is only possible because we possess an ideal, abstract concept of an absolutely straight line, the perfection toward which we strive. In the same way, Aquinas argues that God is the ideal standard against which all existing reality is measured. This brings us to the fifth way of Thomas Aquinas, which is arguably the most famous and intuitively accessible of his 5 arguments. This is the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Aquinas asks us to look closely at nature. We observe that even non-intelligent beings and inanimate objects act as if they are striving toward a specific end or purpose. A bee builds its honeycomb in a perfectly hexagonal shape. A seed once planted sprouts and instinctively reaches for the sun. Planets trace their orbits with astonishing precision. Everything in nature, from the tiniest atom to the most giant galaxies, obeys fixed laws and operates in an orderly fashion, as if everything has a specific destination or destiny. But, Aquinas points out, these objects, seeds, planets, bees, lack the intelligence necessary to set these goals for themselves. A stone doesn't decide on its own to fall downwards. A river doesn't independently choose its own course. They act purposefully, but not by their own will. How can this be? Aquinas uses a simple and powerful analogy. An arrow flying towards a target. The arrow itself is just wood, metal, and feathers. It is unintelligent. It only travels toward the bullseye because an archer directed and released it. Likewise, all non-intelligent objects in nature move toward their specific ends only because they are directed by some intelligent being who established those purposes and laws. This universal archer, who instilled purpose and order into everything in the world, is God. This argument strongly appeals to our sense of wonder regarding the complexity and order of the universe. When we encounter a complex mechanism, such as a clock, we instantly assume it had a maker, a watchmaker. We understand that all those tiny cogs and springs couldn't have randomly assembled themselves into a functional device. Aquinas, and later philosophers like William Paley with his famous watchmaker analogy, invite us to view the entire cosmos as one massive, incredibly intricate machine. We are then forced to draw the same conclusion. Such complexity and precise order cannot be the result of blind chance. They must be the product of intelligent design. The fifth way is ultimately a plea to see the invisible designer behind the visible world. The teleological argument, specifically Aquinas' fifth way, didn't just survive Thomas Aquinas, it thrived. One of its most famous proponents was the 18th century English philosopher William Paley. He is the one responsible for the famous watch analogy that I mentioned earlier. Imagine, Paley says, you are walking across a field and stumble upon a stone. If someone asks where it came from, you could simply answer that it has always been there. It requires no special explanation, but what if, instead of a stone, you encountered a watch? You pick it up, open the casing, and see an intricate mechanism, countless parts perfectly fitted together, working in harmony toward a single goal, telling the time. You would never think that this watch came into existence by chance, or that the wind, rain, and time somehow accidentally assembled its atoms into such a complex device. The complexity, order, and undeniable purposefulness of the design would inescapably point to a creator, a rational watchmaker who designed and assembled the whole thing. Now, Paley argues, look at the world around you. Consider the human eye. It is infinitely more complex than any mere watch. It contains a lens, a retina, an iris, all coordinating to achieve the intricate function of sight. Look at a bird's wing, or the incredibly sophisticated biochemical processes within a single cell. Doesn't all this testify to design with far greater force than a simple timepiece? If a watch requires a watchmaker, then a miracle like the eye surely requires a divine architect. Paley's argument was an immense success because it was so intuitive and clear. He transformed an abstract philosophical concept into a vivid, unforgettable image. The entire world was suddenly seen as a colossal workshop, filled with astonishing inventions that testified to the genius of their creator. For a long time, this argument seemed practically impervious to challenge. Any new discovery in biology, whether describing a complex insect instinct or finding a new organ in an animal, simply added more exhibits to this museum of divine design. It seemed that science itself was continually providing fresh evidence for the existence of the Creator. But, as we will soon see, the very field of science that nourished this argument for so long would ultimately deliver its most devastating blow. Let's take a momentary step back from arguments rooted in logic and the observation of nature and direct our attention towards a completely different domain, the realm of morality. This is often called the moral argument for the existence of God. While this idea existed in various forms before him, it was Immanuel Kant who articulated it most powerfully. Kant, we recall, had thoroughly dismantled the classic proofs, including the ontological argument. Crucially, however, he was not an atheist. He maintained that while the existence of God could not be demonstrated by pure reason, it must be postulated by practical reason, that is, by our inherent moral intuition. The argument proceeds along these lines. Every human being, irrespective of culture or education, possesses an internal sense of duty and an understanding of what constitutes good and evil. We feel compelled to do the right thing, even when it is costly, dangerous, or personally disadvantageous. Kant termed this inherent moral blueprint the categorical imperative. It is objective and universal. We do not invent this law. We find or discover it deep within us. Now we reach the critical question: what is the origin of this objective moral law? If the cosmos is merely the result of random physical processes, and if humanity is simply a bag of chemicals, where does this persistent sense of oughtness originate? In a strictly materialistic worldview, the concepts of good and evil should be nothing more than subjective preferences, products of evolutionary adaptation or societal contract. Yet we experience them as absolute. We inherently believe that genocide, for example, is an objective evil, not merely an ineffective strategy for species survival. According to proponents of the moral argument, the existence of objective morality cannot be accounted for without positing a transcendent source, an absolute lawgiver who implanted this innate sense of right and wrong within us. That lawgiver, they conclude, is God. Furthermore, our moral experience demands that virtue eventually be rewarded and vice punished. In our mortal lives, however, we constantly observe the inverse. The righteous often suffer while the wicked thrive. This leads to a fundamental sense of worldly injustice. Kant argued that the concept of God and the immortality of the soul is necessary to resolve this specific contradiction. It offers the hope that there is ultimate justice, ensuring that the universe is finally morally coherent. Thus, God is not strictly proven by this argument, but is introduced as the essential condition required for our moral lives to be truly meaningful. Now we step onto the ground that is perhaps the slipperiest yet, for many the most compelling, the argument based on personal experience and miracles. While all our previous arguments attempted to reach God through reason, this one appeals directly to feelings, intuition, and events that seem to transcend the ordinary. Throughout history, billions of people have claimed they personally experienced the presence of God. This might manifest as a profound religious feeling during prayer, an overwhelming sense of awe before the beauty of nature, a sudden spiritual insight, or a powerful feeling of unconditional love and acceptance. These experiences, often referred to as numinous experiences, are frequently described as ineffable, beyond words, yet they are profoundly real to the person who has undergone them. For someone who has had such an experience, logical proofs become entirely unnecessary. Their faith is not built on syllogisms, but on direct personal testimony. They can tell a skeptic, "I know God exists because I felt him." Naturally, from the standpoint of rigorous logic, this argument is extremely weak. It is fundamentally unfalsifiable. The skeptic can always counter that the experience was simply a hallucination, a trick of the imagination, the result of specific brain activity, or mere emotional turmoil. Yet for the believer, the experience remains undeniable. The other side of this argument is miracles. Stories of miraculous healings, inexplicable rescues, appearances of saints, and other supernatural occurrences form a vital part of many faiths. If even one such event truly occurred, if a clear violation of natural law was documented that defies all naturalistic explanation, it would serve as powerful evidence for the existence of a supernatural force capable of intervening in those laws. The philosopher David Hume, whom we will discuss further, famously argued that belief in a miracle is never rational. He contended that the probability that a witness is mistaken, lying, or misinterpreting an event is always higher than the probability that the laws of nature, confirmed by countless observations, have actually been violated. Nonetheless, accounts of miracles continue to surface. This particular argument is unique because it shifts the debate entirely from the realm of public logic into the highly personal, subjective sphere of faith. It doesn't attempt to convince everyone, but rather states a fact. For vast numbers of people, God is not a philosophical abstraction, but a living reality they actively engage with. We've looked at the primary arguments for belief. Now, the pendulum swings the other way. We begin with the oldest, the most powerful, and arguably the most agonizing argument against the existence of God, as traditionally conceived, the problem of evil. Its classic formulation is often attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, laid out as a merciless logical puzzle known as Epicurus' trilemma. This challenge questions the compatibility of three key statements. God is omnipotent, God is benevolent, or all good, and evil exists in the world. Let's break it down. Scenario 1. God wishes to eliminate evil but cannot. Then he is not omnipotent. Scenario 2. God can eliminate evil but chooses not to. Then he is not benevolent but malevolent. Scenario 3. God both can and wishes to eliminate evil. Then why does evil exist at all? Scenario 4. God neither can nor wishes to. Then why call him God? This seemingly simple dilemma has been the chief stumbling block for theologians for centuries. After all, evil in the world is not some abstract concept. It is tangible, real suffering, disease, famine, war, natural disasters, and cruelty. The problem of innocent suffering is particularly acute. Why must a small child die from a torturous illness? Why are entire nations victims of genocide? If there is an all-powerful, loving creator, why is this allowed? Attempts to answer this question gave rise to an entire field of theology called theodicy, which translates literally as the justification of God. One of the most common responses is the free will argument. Theologians argue that God granted humans free will because love and virtue are only meaningful when freely chosen. A robot programmed solely for goodness is not truly good. But in granting this freedom, God also allowed the potential for its abuse. The majority of moral evil in the world, war, murder, betrayal, is the direct result of humanity misusing its liberty. However, this answer fails to account for natural evil, earthquakes, tsunamis, and epidemics, which cause immense suffering but are unconnected to human choice. Ultimately, the problem of evil remains the most severe test of faith for many believers, and for skeptics, it serves as the primary proof that if God does exist, he is either not omnipotent or not benevolent, or perhaps neither. Let's step back into the Enlightenment, a time where critical thinking truly blossomed, and meet one of the most incisive critics of religious arguments, the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume was a committed empiricist, holding that all human knowledge is derived solely from sensory experience. Using this foundation, he delivered a crushing blow to two major pillars of theistic belief: the argument from design and the credibility of miracles. We begin with the design argument, the one William Paley famously articulated using his beautiful watch analogy. Hume's primary target was the analogy itself, comparing the universe to a complex manufactured mechanism. He pointed out, when we see a house, we infer an architect because we have witnessed countless instances of people building houses. This conclusion is grounded in extensive, repeatable experience. But the universe, Hume stressed, is a singular phenomenon. We have never observed a universe being created. We lack the necessary comparative experience of world-making. treating the cosmos like a wristwatch, therefore, is an unjustified intellectual jump. Perhaps the universe is less like a mechanism and more like a massive organism that grows and develops on its own. Or maybe it wasn't the work of a single, omnipotent God, but a whole team of divine designers who might not have been very skilled. Maybe our world is simply a botched first draft, abandoned by a careless celestial student. Hume shows that the watchmaker analogy is only one possibility among many, and we have no rational basis for choosing it above others. Furthermore, even if we accept the need for a designer, the observable world, rife with imperfections, suffering and chaos, suggests a creator who is either not entirely powerful, not entirely benevolent, or perhaps just indifferent. The world simply does not appear to be the handiwork of a perfect being. Hume then pivoted to the critique of miracles, where he formulated what many consider to be a truly devastating principle. A miracle is defined as a violation of the laws of nature. But what are the laws of nature? They are conclusions drawn from the vast, uniform, and unwavering experience of all humanity. For instance, we know that the dead do not rise. Now imagine someone claims they witnessed a person resurrected, which carries greater weight of probability that an immutable law of nature was suspended, or that the witness is mistaken, deluded, or deliberately lying. Hume asserted that in every single instance it is overwhelmingly more rational to choose the latter explanation. The testimony of one or even a few individuals, no matter how honest or reputable they appear, can never overcome the universal, constant experience of all humankind. Hume's philosophical assault was so profound that, in its wake, the traditional defence of these classical theological arguments became infinitely more difficult. Following Hume, another giant of thought takes centre stage, Immanuel Kant. We've already discussed him in the context of his critique of the ontological argument and his own moral argument, but his contribution to this debate goes much deeper. Kant essentially drew a line in the sand, a distinction that philosophy hasn't been able to ignore ever since. He divided the world into two parts, the world of phenomena and the world of noumena. Phenomena is the world as we perceive it through our senses, structured and organised by our own minds. This is the world of science, the world of cause and effect, the world we can actually study. Noumena, on the other hand, is the world of things in themselves, reality as it truly exists, independent of our perception. And here is Kant's crucial conclusion. Our reason can only grasp the world of phenomena. We can never truly know what the noumenal world is like. We are effectively trapped within the limits of our own perception and categories of thought. What does this mean for the proofs of God's existence? It means they are all fundamentally doomed to fail. Why? Because God, by definition, belongs to the noumenal world. He is not an object of our experience, nor is he part of the chain of cause and effect that we observe. He lies entirely outside this sensible world. All our proofs, such as Aquinas' cosmological argument, take concepts from our phenomenal world, like the concept of cause, and try to illegitimately apply them to the noumenal world, to what lies beyond any possible experience. According to Kant, this is like trying to measure the temperature of love with a thermometer. We are using the wrong tool for the job. Our reason is designed to understand the world of appearances, and when it attempts to look beyond those limits, it inevitably falls into contradictions, or what Kant called antinomies. For instance, reason can argue with equal success that the world had a beginning in time, and that it has existed eternally. Thus, Kant was not trying to prove that God doesn't exist. He was proving something far more fundamental, that the question of God's existence is, in principle, beyond the capabilities of human reason. Science can never prove or disprove God because it deals only with phenomena. Philosophy, based on pure logic, also fails because it tries to apply its categories where they simply don't operate. For Kant, the question of God is not one of knowledge, but of faith. And this faith, as we remember, finds its grounding not in logical proofs, but in the requirements of our moral consciousness. Kant's work became a true watershed moment, after which any naive confidence in the possibility of rationally proving God was profoundly undermined. Now let's fast forward almost 2 centuries to our modern era and meet the main voice of the new atheism, the British biologist Richard Dawkins. His 2006 book, The God Delusion, became a global bestseller and the true manifesto of the modern atheist movement. Dawkins attacks religion from the standpoint of science and rationalism. His primary assault is aimed at the most popular and seemingly convincing version of the teleological argument, the argument from complexity. Dawkins agrees with Paley and other theists on one point. Life on Earth is incredibly complex. The complexity of living organisms, their apparent design, certainly demands an explanation. Simply saying it's random chance is unsatisfactory. But Dawkins argues the explanation, God did it, is even worse. Why? Because it's not an explanation at all. It's an evasion of the answer. If we attempt to explain the complexity of the world by invoking an even more complex entity, a designer God, we immediately face a new, even more difficult question. Who designed the designer? This leads us straight into infinite regress. Dawkins calls this the argument from personal incredulity. We cannot imagine how complexity could have arisen on its own, and so we invent God. But science, Dawkins asserts, offers a far superior, more elegant, and more powerful explanation. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. It was Darwin, in Dawkins' view, who made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Natural selection is a blind, non-conscious, automatic process that is nevertheless capable of generating staggering complexity and the illusion of design, step by step, over millions of years. It works as a cumulative process. Random mutations create variation, and the environment selects those organisms whose traits are most successful for survival and reproduction. Generation after generation, these small improvements accumulate, building complex organs like the eye or the wing. Evolution thus provides the answer to Paley's riddle. The watchmaker does exist, but it is not an intelligent God. It is the blind watchmaker of natural selection. For Dawkins, the God hypothesis is not only unnecessary for explaining the world, but also highly improbable. A supernatural, hyper-intelligent creator is the most complex and statistically improbable entity imaginable. Let's begin with another powerful tool in the modern skeptic's arsenal, the famous thought experiment known as Russell's teapot. It was first introduced by the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in the mid-20th century. This argument is not an attempt to disprove God's existence. Instead, it aims at a subtler, more critical target, the concept of the burden of proof. Imagine Russell proposes that I assert a porcelain teapot is currently orbiting the Sun on an elliptical path between Earth and Mars. Crucially, this teapot is so small that even our most powerful telescopes are incapable of detecting it. Now he asks, are you required to believe me? And, more to the point, should I expect your belief simply because you lack the ability to disprove my assertion? The obvious answer is no. That would be completely absurd. Russell argues that if he were to make such a bold statement, the onus would be entirely on him to provide evidence, not on those who doubt. The burden of proof must always rest on the individual making a positive affirmation, especially when that claim is extraordinary and inherently unfalsifiable. This is where Russell draws the direct analogy to the concept of God. The assertion, God exists, is a positive claim regarding the existence of a specific entity. Russell suggests that many believers unfairly shift the burden of proof by demanding that atheists disprove this existence. This, he states, is exactly like asking astronomers to prove that the porcelain teapot is not there. It is fundamentally impossible to prove a negative. You cannot prove the non-existence of unicorns, fairies, or the flying spaghetti monster. All you can say is that there is no reason to believe they exist. Russell's teapot, therefore, entirely flips the typical logic of the religious debate. The atheist is not obliged to prove God's absence. Their position is the default position, justified by the sheer lack of compelling evidence for the claim. This is the skeptic saying, "Show me the evidence, and perhaps I will believe." Until that evidence arrives, they have no more reason to believe in the God of Abraham than they do in the Olympian gods, Odin, or that fictional celestial teapot. This simple yet elegant argument has become a cornerstone of the skeptical approach. It powerfully highlights that non-belief is not a faith in itself, but rather a rational refusal to accept claims unsupported by sufficient evidence. In essence, Russell's teapot shifts the entire weight of the proof back where it belongs, squarely onto the shoulders of those making the extraordinary claim. Following Richard Dawkins' lead, let's explore a broader concept we can call the argument from scientific sufficiency. The core idea is simple. As science progresses, the space previously occupied by God continuously shrinks. Historically, people attributed lightning to the wrath of Zeus or Thor. Today, we understand it as an electrical discharge in the atmosphere. Diseases were once seen as divine punishment or the work of demons. Now, we have knowledge of microbes, viruses, and genetic mutations. The origin of life, consciousness, morality, all those mysteries once cited as irrefutable proof of divine intervention, are steadily becoming subjects of rigorous scientific inquiry. This phenomenon has been dubbed the God of the Gaps. The concept is that God is used as a convenient placeholder for the holes in our knowledge that science hasn't yet filled. We don't know how life began. Therefore, God must have created it. We don't understand consciousness. It must be an immortal soul. But the history of science, skeptics argue, is a history of these gaps constantly shrinking. Science methodically, step by step, reclaims territory from the supernatural. And there is no reason to assume this process will ever halt. Problems that seem unsolvable today may be fully explained by new scientific theories tomorrow. Therefore, appealing to God as an explanation is not just intellectually lazy, it is strategically unsound. You are building your faith on the shifting sands of our temporary ignorance, and those sands are constantly being washed away by the tides of scientific progress. The most prominent example, of course, is Darwin's theory of evolution. It dealt a decisive blow to the argument from design by showing how the complexity and diversity of life could arise without an intelligent creator. Similarly, modern cosmology, with its theories of the Big Bang and inflation, offers a naturalistic explanation for the universe's origin, one that, many physicists argue, does not require a first cause in the traditional sense. For instance, in his final book, Stephen Hawking wrote that because the laws of gravity exist, the universe could and must have created itself from nothing. Thus, science offers a comprehensive, self-sufficient worldview where the God hypothesis simply becomes redundant. God becomes an extraneous entity that can be shaved off, using the famous principle of Occam's razor, which states, entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. Let's take a deep dive into how modern cosmology has impacted one of the oldest arguments for God, the cosmological argument. A quick reminder, the core premise of this argument is that everything requires a cause, meaning the universe itself must have an uncaused first cause, God. This argument, particularly the version known as the Kalam cosmological argument, which posits that everything that begins to exist must have a cause, once seemed exceptionally robust. After all, 20th century science, driven by the discovery of the Big Bang, confirmed that our universe did have a definitive beginning. This seemingly offered scientific validation for the necessity of a creator. The universe originated about 13.8 billion years ago, suggesting that something must have initiated that explosive process. However, subsequent developments in physics and cosmology have rendered the overall picture far more complex and ambiguous. First, the laws of physics as we understand them break down at the moment of singularity, the absolute initial point of the Big Bang. The concepts of time and causality simply lose their meaning there. According to some scientists, asking what was before the Big Bang is as nonsensical as asking what lies north of the North Pole. Time itself originated along with the universe. As Stephen Hawking famously stated, if the universe had no beginning in time, in the traditional sense we understand it, then there is no role left for a creator. Second, new hypotheses have emerged, proposing mechanisms for the universe's creation without any external cause. For instance, certain quantum mechanics models suggest the universe could have arisen as a spontaneous quantum fluctuation in nothing, specifically the vacuum, which in physics is far from an absolute void. Third, the multiverse hypothesis has gained immense popularity. According to some versions of string theory and eternal inflation theory, our universe is just one of countless bubbles within a gigantic cosmic foam, the multiverse. New universes are constantly being born from the old ones. In this scenario, the question of a first cause for our specific universe loses its urgency. It could have emerged from a prior universe or simply according to the inherent laws governing the multiverse structure. In summary, modern cosmology doesn't necessarily disprove the idea of a creator God, but it offers compelling alternative, purely naturalistic scenarios that render the God hypothesis unnecessary. It demonstrates that the core philosophical assumption underlying the cosmological argument, the phrase "nothing comes from nothing," may be fundamentally flawed at the quantum level. Another field of science offering naturalistic explanations for phenomena traditionally attributed to the divine is neurobiology. We've previously discussed the argument from personal religious experience. For many believers, these experiences, whether it's a feeling of oneness with the universe, a sense of divine presence, or actual visions, are the most compelling proof of their faith. But what if these profound experiences could be explained by processes occurring within our own brains? Modern neurobiology is actively investigating the brain during prayer, meditation, and other religious practices. Using methods like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, scientists can observe exactly which brain regions activate during these moments. Research indicates that intense religious experiences correlate with activity in specific areas, such as the temporal lobes, the limbic system, which governs emotions, and the parietal lobes, which are responsible for our sense of self and spatial boundaries. Some researchers, like Canadian neuroscientist Michael Persinger, have taken this concept even further. He engineered the so-called God helmet, a device that uses weak magnetic fields to stimulate the brain's temporal lobes. Many subjects who wore this helmet reported experiences strikingly similar to mystical ones, sensing an invisible presence, having out-of-body experiences, or feeling a profound sense of meaning. Other studies connect religious feelings to specific neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. Furthermore, conditions like temporal lobe epilepsy have been shown to trigger powerful and vivid religious visions in some individuals. What does all this imply? For staunch skeptics like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, it suggests that religious experience is simply a product of brain function. It is a natural phenomenon that can be studied, explained, and even artificially induced. In this view, God is not an external reality, but merely a pattern of neural activity. Of course, believers offer a strong counter-argument. They propose that the brain isn't a generator of religious experience, but rather a receiver. It doesn't create the spiritual experience. Instead, it simply allows us to tune into a divine reality that exists independently of us. The mere correlation we observe between brain activity and a spiritual event does not prove that one causes the other. Nevertheless, neurobiological research undermines the perceived uniqueness and supernatural nature of religious experience by offering a plausible, naturalistic explanation. It might seem that science has already delivered a devastating blow to the classical arguments for God's existence. Evolution accounted for biological design, and cosmology explained the origin of the universe itself. Yet, here is the paradox. From the very depths of modern physics and cosmology, has emerged perhaps the strongest and most debated contemporary argument for a creator, the fine-tuning argument. What does it state? Scientists have discovered that life as we know it depends on an incredibly precise and delicate balance of the universe's fundamental physical constants and initial conditions. If these values were even slightly different, the cosmos would be utterly transformed and most likely barren of life. Let's look at a few examples. First, the force of gravity. If it were just slightly stronger, the universe would have rapidly collapsed back in on itself after the Big Bang, preventing the formation of stars and galaxies. If it were slightly weaker, matter would have dispersed too rapidly, and stars wouldn't have been able to form either. Another example is the nuclear force responsible for fusion in stars. If this force were a few percent weaker, stars would only produce hydrogen, and we wouldn't have the heavier elements necessary to compose our bodies. If it were marginally stronger, all the hydrogen in stars would burn up almost instantaneously. Consider the ratio of the proton to neutron mass. If this ratio were altered, stable atoms simply wouldn't exist. This list of cosmic coincidences is astoundingly long. The probability that all these constants randomly assumed exactly the life-permitting values is infinitesimal. It's like walking into a room with 1,000 dials and every single one must be set to the precise position to turn on the light. Proponents of the fine-tuning argument contend that this astonishing cosmic bullseye cannot be mere chance. It points to one of two things: either an intelligent designer who deliberately set the universe's parameters to allow for life, or the multiverse hypothesis. Under the multiverse theory, there exists a vast, perhaps infinite number of universes, each governed by different physical laws and constants. It's therefore not surprising that we find ourselves in the specific universe whose conditions happen to be suitable for our existence. This concept is known as the anthropic principle. The debate between these two explanations, designer or multiverse, is ongoing. But the crucial takeaway is this: modern science, perhaps unintentionally, has resurrected the good old argument from design, but now in a new, far more sophisticated and mathematically robust form. Finally, let's return to the most challenging issue of all, the problem of evil. We will examine how modern theology and philosophy attempt to address it, seeking to defend the notion of an all-good and all-powerful God. As we recall, the main difficulty isn't so much moral evil, which can often be attributed to human free will, but natural evil, disease, catastrophes, and the suffering of animals. Contemporary defenders of faith, such as the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, have developed a more sophisticated version of the free will defense. Plantinga argues that it is logically possible that God could not create a world containing free creatures who would never choose to do evil. In other words, a world with freedom, but without evil, is a logical contradiction, and even God's omnipotence does not extend to creating logical impossibilities. He cannot create a square circle. Plantinga also extends the concept of free will to the natural world. He posits that natural catastrophes could be the result of actions taken by powerful, yet fallen, supernatural beings, such as angels or demons, who also possess free will. While this sounds rather strange to modern ears, Plantinga contends that it is at least logically possible, thereby removing the formal contradiction between the existence of God and natural evil. Another popular approach is the so-called soul-making theodicy. Proponents of this view, such as the philosopher John Hick, argue that God did not create the world as a paradise for carefree pleasure, but rather as an arena for soul-making. A world full of challenges, hardships, suffering, and imperfection is considered the best possible environment for cultivating virtues such as courage, compassion, patience, and love. In an ideal world devoid of pain and struggle, we would simply lack the opportunity to demonstrate and develop these virtues. We would remain infantile, immature beings. Suffering, from this perspective, is not meaningless evil, but a necessary tool for our spiritual growth, a bitter medicine that ultimately makes us better people. This approach doesn't attempt to justify every instance of suffering, but provides an overarching framework in which a world full of evil can be compatible with the plan of a loving God. Of course, neither of these answers is fully satisfactory. They do not alleviate the emotional weight of the problem. However, they demonstrate that the intellectual debate is far from over, and that theologians continue to seek ways to reconcile faith in a good God with the reality of our cruel and imperfect world. We have completed this incredible journey. We travelled from the strict scholasticism of Thomas Aquinas, who attempted to build a logical ladder to heaven, to the devastating critiques of David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who demonstrated the inherent limits of human reason. We saw how William Paley's elegant watchmaker analogy was seemingly dismantled by the blind watchmaker theory put forth by Charles Darwin and Richard Dawkins. We immersed ourselves in modern cosmology, where the Big Bang and the multiverse seem to strip God of the role of first cause, only to immediately present a staggering new argument, the fine-tuning of the universe. Perhaps the central irony, the main plot twist, of this entire history is that the debate never gets simpler. Instead, with every new scientific discovery and philosophical breakthrough, it becomes more complex, nuanced, and ultimately more intriguing. Science has not been able to definitively kill God, as some predicted. Simultaneously, a naive faith that hasn't passed through the crucible of criticism and doubt looks incredibly unconvincing today. We clearly see that neither side has achieved a knockout blow or a final victory. The arguments for and against remain poised on the scales, and which side finally tips the balance depends entirely on an individual's personal choice, on their intuition, experience, and worldview. This eternal argument is much more than an intellectual game. It strikes the deepest chords within us, forcing us to contemplate the meaning of life, the nature of reality, and the essence of good and evil. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this discussion has given you food for thought, please support the channel with a like and subscription so you don't miss our upcoming deep dive analyses. Now I pose the main question to you. Which of these many arguments, whether for or against, did you find the most persuasive? And why? Whose perspective? Aquinas's, Kant's, Dawkins's, or someone else's, do you find yourself leaning toward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this vital discussion going.